Hello and welcome to States of Corruption. I'm Patricia Carvelis. There are growing calls for the introduction of a National Integrity Commission to investigate and expose corruption and serious misconduct at the federal level. It comes following the resignation of Gladys Berejiklian as New South Wales Premier in the wake of an investigation by the state's anti-corruption watchdog over potential breaches of public trust during her secret relationship with the former Liberal MP Daryl Maguire. Now, Labor claims the proposed Federal Integrity Commission would be so weak and secretive that instead of exposing corruption, it would cover it up. Coming up this evening, we talk to a high-profile whistleblower, award-winning investigative journalists, top legal experts, and those who want to see an end to the states of corruption. Political scandals, resignations and exposing dishonesty and abuses of power. Every Australian state now has its own anti-corruption watchdog, as reporter Nick Harmson explains.
Few anti-corruption bodies have the profile of the New South Wales ICAC. It has a penchant for public hearings and a reputation for prompting the resignation of premiers, just as it has with Gladys Berejiklian, amid an investigation into whether she should have declared her relationship with fellow MP Daryl Maguire.
I did not join the dots. I did not think that there was anything untoward. I did not think there was anything I had to report, and if there was, I would have.
Politicians are also in the glare of Victoria's ICAC, as it continues to trawl through evidence of so-called branch stacking.
In the early 90s, mid-90s, throughout the 90s, branch stacking was rife in the ALP.
While both East Coast inquiries are ongoing and have not resulted in formal findings, South Australia's public integrity body has been making headlines for very different reasons.
The jurisdiction to investigate corruption has been decimated.
SA's ICAC has always been a different beast. Designed to operate almost entirely in the shadows, the role of Commissioner is designed to make recommendations to prosecutors, not to make findings of corruption. It was created by a former Labor government, less than enthused by the need for an ICAC at all.
The models we've seen operating interstate have not, in my view, proved to be an efficient or cost-effective means of preventing or uncovering corruption.
The Liberal Party led the charge for ICAC from opposition, even promising to allow public hearings for some investigations. Now, in government,
the ICAC has been very bad, very poor at getting convictions, but very, very good at destroying the reputations of people that they think are guilty.
In a stark turnaround in September, the SA Parliament voted unanimously to strip ICAC of some of its powers.
I'll put the question. Those of the opinion say aye. Against say no. It's carried the clerk.
The changes mean the Commissioner will no longer be able to examine misconduct or maladministration. The definition of corruption itself has been narrowed and the protections of parliamentary privilege widened.
Everybody in this debate has had different views. We've considered them all and we have identified significant areas which are in agreement, including the focus on corruption.
Those who led the charge for change say it was justified by a series of problematic prosecutions and investigations, including one involving senior police officer Doug Barr, who committed suicide.
It was like waiting for a bomb to go off. Doug was reaching his breaking point. He couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep, he would wander the house all night long.
The significant delays, the lack of communication, the secrecy and the pressure to not be able to talk to anyone about it for 3 years. I believe that all of these were a consequence of the way ICAC was conducting itself.
You don't solve that problem by emasculating a body like this, and I think that this has set back integrity in South Australia very considerably.
The former judges who've led SA's ICAC have their own view on the motivations for the swift change.
The effect of this bill is to protect corrupt politicians and to protect corrupt police officers.
The politicians set up ICACs, and then as soon as the ICACs get a bit close to them, they want to dismantle them.
And ICAC certainly is getting a bit close. Last year, a series of exclusive ABC stories saw the anti-corruption body investigate several MPs over their expense claims. One, Fraser Ellis, will face trial next year, accused of ripping off taxpayers by more than $18,000.
Plead not guilty, and I'm looking forward to clearing my name.
Files on two other MPs sit with the Director of Public Prosecutions for consideration.
Watchdogs around the country have revealed extraordinary levels of corruption across both sides of politics. Joining me now is award-winning investigative journalist Kate McClimate from the Sydney Morning Herald. Reporter Paul Farrell from the ABC's flagship current affairs program 7:30 joins me too. Welcome to both of you. Starting with you, Kate, the ICAC has come under significant criticism from Conservative politicians for destroying careers and smearing innocent people. Is that a fair assessment that ICAC has sometimes gone too far?
No, look, I don't think it is. And I think what people don't understand is that there has already been an enormous amount of research and investigation that has already gone on before we get to a public hearing. So there's already been private hearings. The evidence has already been aired in private. So I think that there are sufficient checks and balances to stop that occurring.
Just walk me through that, Kate, in terms of the sort of hoops that have to be jumped over before you get to the point where, as happened recently with Gladys Berejiklian, the ICAC makes a statement saying that they're launching this investigation.
Well, often there'll be a referral to the Independent Commission Against Corruption, and there are independent panels who actually look at the referrals. It then goes to an investigative unit if it's deemed that there's something worthy there. And then there's a very long process of investigation. Like sometimes this can take a year. And so in that time, there are notices to produce. There is evidence given in secret, and there is a case compiled. Now, sometimes they will do all that and they'll decide, look, there isn't enough here, we're not going to go ahead with it. So as soon as you read an announcement that there's going to be a public hearing, you know that there's usually something significant behind it because the work has already been done.
Paul, we've got models across the country now in all states and territories. How much of a gaping hole is the absence of one federally?
I think it's a really striking absence, and certainly if you look at the range of legal groups, of civil society groups, and of all kinds of other kind of members of society who have said we absolutely need a federal ICAC, then this really sort of highlights how serious this issue is. The importance of having a federal anti-corruption body is that it provides it's effectively the way that integrity bodies have been set up is that the idea is that they're a fourth branch of government. They're a check on the executive and they're a check on the public service to ensure that there isn't any sort of misconduct or corrupt conduct that is happening. Now, it's true that we do have other forms of bodies that can monitor the executive, that can monitor the public service, like the Auditor General, but that has a very narrow and tailored function, whereas what corruption bodies do is what anti-corruption bodies do, I should say, is investigate corruption. That's their specific task, and that's what they need to weed out. And often, historically, looking at what's happened with the different states and territories, they've come at times and they've been introduced at times where there has been a real decrease in trust in governance. And that's certainly what happened in New South Wales when Nick Greiner introduced a bill for the first ICAC that we now continue to have there today.
Kate McClimate, this debate around private versus public evidence and the playing out of these kind of hearings has been really contentious. Talk me through the significance or the importance of that public process of a witness, as we recently saw with Gladys Berejiklian, sitting in the witness box and providing that evidence.
Look, I think it goes to what Paul was just saying, is that the whole point of having anti-corruption watchdogs is so that people can see the light being shone on institutions or people who, may not be doing the right thing. And that's why it's so important to have them in public, often because further evidence may come forward once people start hearing evidence. And it also shows people that, if you think that you can get away with, awarding a major contract to your own family, then it's likely that you may be caught out with this. And with regard to our most recent Premier, Gladys Berejiklian, I think it's one of those things that shows that no one is above the law. No one is above being looked at for corrupt activities. And I just hope that it keeps public servant and our politicians and others on their toes, thinking the last place I want to be is making the loneliest walk in the world, and that is to the witness box at the ICAC.
Yeah, Paul, there is that, but then even Labor and Labor federally is arguing that the Morrison government's proposal is toothless, that it's not strong enough. But Labor is even saying that perhaps the ICAC could be modified at a federal level to try and ensure that reputational damage is controlled, that you don't have these kind of instances where people are just witnesses and get smeared. Do you think those kind of changes might be necessary to try and deal with some of those criticisms?
Well, I mean, it's interesting when you let's take it, looking at it in the opposite direction for the sort of scenario that I think some critics of federal integrity agencies and for the very idea of corruption bodies seem to be saying, and that is that, from what I can gather, some seem to be suggesting that hearings should be held entirely in private or and shouldn't be public at all. I mean, you could imagine the situation then where, for 2 years, a federal corruption body is potentially investigating a politician, if it even has the powers to do that, and there's some debate around whether it will anyway. But let's say it investigates a politician for 2 years entirely in secret, and then suddenly one day just drops a report and says, we think this person's corrupt. I think you could imagine that actually there would be probably equal outroar at a process held entirely in secret as well. The public hearings are equally an opportunity for people who there may be questions around their conduct to put their case forward. And it is important to note, as Kate also said, that there is a thinking process, certainly at the New South Wales ICAC and in other jurisdictions, that has to occur first by the commissioners before they determine to hold a hearing public. They have to determine that it's in the public interest, and they have to make a consideration that the public interest in making certain matters public outweighs the private interests or rights of other individuals. And so this isn't just some sort of cavalier thing that just comes out of the blue. It's a very, very well-considered idea. Thanks to both of you. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Kate McClimate and Paul Farrell there. Well, let's take a look back at some of the high-profile scalps.
One corruption investigation, 4 MPs. Aged Care Minister Luke Donnellan had little to sing about today after becoming the 4th Labor MP to quit Cabinet, accused of branch stacking.
I have no option but to resign from the office of Premier. My resignation will take effect as soon as the New South Wales Liberal Party can elect a new parliamentary leader. In order to allow the new leader and government a fresh start, I'll also resign from the New South Wales Parliament.
I will be resigning the position and enabling a new Liberal leader to be elected, someone who will then become the Premier of New South Wales.
For the past decade, the law has been catching up with Eddie Obeid. Already on parole after spending 3 years behind bars over his family's Circular Quay cafe leases, he's now been found guilty of conspiring with his son Moses Obeid and former mining minister Ian McDonald. Freedom proved fleeting for Eddie Obeid.
How do you feel about the prospect of going to jail?
Nothing to say.
Any regrets,
Mr.
Obeid? Do you have anything to say?
The former Labor kingmaker will spend at least 3 years and 10 months behind bars for conspiring over a coal licence.
I have told His Excellency the Governor that later today, after the Liberal Party has elected a new leader,
that I will tender my resignation, and obviously the new Liberal leader will become the new Premier of New South Wales. You could imagine my sense of outrage about what does amount to being shot a couple of days before the trial, but nevertheless politics is what it is.
Politics is what it is. Jeff Morris says his life was threatened and his career ruined when he blew the whistle on misconduct in the Commonwealth Bank. Jeff, welcome to the program. Obviously, being a whistleblower, quite obviously looking at your experience, comes at a terrible cost, right?
Yes, absolutely it does. It's very hard rationally to justify a choice like that, and there's, you know, your career is ruined. It puts enormous stress on your family. Normally, you lose your family. And, you know, normally you wind up with a diagnosis for PTSD. So I find that today a lot of people I talk to, you know, who are thinking of becoming a whistleblower, probably only 1 in 100 actually goes ahead.
And that just to suggest that there are 99 others that might know things that we don't know about, which is alarming. What protections then do whistleblowers need in order to be able to come forward and actually share stories that improve institutions? Well,
look, this federal government that doesn't want to have a federal ICAC promised to put in place some proper whistleblower protections, and because whistleblowers are subject to enormous retaliation and it's a very one-sided battle, this government not only reneged on the promise to put in place any proper whistleblower protection.
I think we've got some trouble there with the Skype line. We're speaking there with the whistleblower Jeff Morris. Hopefully we can get him back because, of course, his experience in the Commonwealth Bank was quite key to being able to reveal some of those controversies. But the broader issue around whistleblowers being able to share their stories and change institutions, whether they be government or departments, is pretty key given the information that many of them have. In the meantime, pressure is mounting on the federal government to establish a National Integrity Commission. The Greens and independents like Jackie Lambie, Helen Haines and Zali Steggall have worked together to introduce separate private members' bills, saying such a body is long overdue. I was joined by one of those crossbenchers, South Australian Senator Rex Patrick, a short time ago. Senator Patrick, welcome.
Good afternoon.
The federal government announced it would create a Commonwealth Integrity Commission now almost 3 years ago. Are you confident the government will be able to pass legislation by the end of the year?
I have no confidence that they can do that. A bill like that would have to be introduced into the Parliament and go through its normal Senate scrutiny stage of an inquiry. There is no time for that to be done.
Is it your view that the definition of corruption that they've constructed, at least, you know, at this stage, we're still yet to see that final legislation, but do you think it's too narrow and that the threshold for referral to this commission is just too high?
We've got to have a fairly wide definition of corruption, things that cover off on anything that really interferes or causes impartiality in the way in which a Commonwealth official or a politician conduct their affairs. Unfortunately, the government's bill doesn't do that.
So let's talk about some things we're noticing at the moment. Things are in the news. The courts are looking at this issue in relation, for instance, to Minister Michael Sukkar. Would that be the sort of issue in relation to using taxpayer funded staff to work on political matters that you think that an Integrity Commission should be looking at federally?
Well, that's a misuse of public funds, if indeed that is proved to be the case. And that's just one kind of conduct that is not acceptable by most Australians.
And would the current body that's being proposed by the Morrison government be able to handle something like that?
Look, I don't think it would. The definition is too narrow. Their bar basically sits at a criminal level. Not all things are criminal. Things like misfeasance, malfeasance, doing favours, they don't necessarily constitute a crime, but they are an abuse.
Another example I can think of in recent-ish times is the Badgerys Creek deal. Is that the sort of thing that you think that an Commonwealth Integrity Commission should look at?
Well, one of the nice things about an Integrity Commission is it has extensive powers to examine these sorts of matters, and they go through a preliminary process that doesn't cause any damage to any reputations at all. A prima facie case must be made out before they extend to more detailed and perhaps public inquiries. And the Badgerys Creek is a good example where that could have occurred, and perhaps findings come out that can then be dealt with.
You're not the only independent who's raised issues with this. The federal opposition also thinks that the model they've proposed is not good enough. But when it does at some point come to the Senate and you have to deal with this, do you accept that something is better than nothing, given we don't have a federal integrity commission at all right now?
I think there's a point in which you say that something is in fact worse than nothing, because it gives the perception that in actual fact the matter has been dealt with when it hasn't. One of the reasons why you have an ICAC is because it acts as a deterrent, and a successful ICAC, in my view, is one that never gets a referral. We've got to have some strength in it to make it worthwhile. To just have what is a sort of toothless tiger or a toothless watchdog with a limp and a bung ear, that's not going to cut it.
Okay, so right now, as it stands, and as our viewers know, we don't have the final legislation, but as it stands from what the government's been talking about, would that be a toothless tiger that you think is not worth voting in favour of?
Well, we've seen what they've done in the past. That wasn't good enough. We've also heard the commentary of people like the Prime Minister who are doing what they've promised very reluctantly. I can't imagine why it has taken 3 years to get to the point of bringing something to the Parliament. No one in government wants to see this, particularly when you've got a government that has had all sorts of accusations thrown at it. They just seem like they don't really want to do anything.
So just to be clear, if this kind of version comes before you, is it your inclination to vote it down?
Well, I have to be fair about this. I haven't seen what they've proposed, but it will have to meet a particular benchmark before I could vote for it. It has to be credible in its nature. The idea that, for example, a member of the public who witnesses something can't make a referral is just wrong. When a referral is made by someone from the public, the process under the bill that Helen Haynes has proposed basically allows the Commission to examine whether or not there's prima facie evidence. Very quickly you can filter out where a complaint is vexatious or it lacks evidence. Why would you not let members of the public who witness concerning conduct raise that with an ICAC?
The Deputy Prime Minister and Nationals leader, Barnaby Joyce, has said the New South Wales ICAC, the ICAC, is kind of, operates like a Spanish Inquisition, I think was the language he used. This is in the wake of the Gladys Berejiklian investigation. There are many people, as you know, on the Conservative side of politics, particularly, who feel like this kind of way that these hearings are held publicly means that there's guilt by association for some people who give evidence. Do you share any of their concerns?
Well, if you look what's happened with Gladys Berejiklian, in actual fact, her matter was kept very quiet until such time as it reached a particular threshold. And we've now seen what the concerns of the Commission were played out in a public forum where we can see what the prosecution's allegations are, we can see the defence, we can make sure the Corruption Commission itself is not acting in a manner that's untoward. And in this instance, there are questions around Gladys Berejiklian. We'll wait until those that have heard all of the evidence make a finding, but there is something there and it needed to be examined.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
That's Independent Senator Rex Patrick. Well, many Australians will recall the extraordinary impact of the Queensland and West Australian Royal Commissions into government corruption in the 1980s and the 1990s. But Royal Commissions are established by the government and they set the scope of the investigation. It takes extraordinary political pressure before a wide-ranging inquiry into alleged corruption is even established. Attorney General Michaelia Cash is working through findings from the public consultation ahead of a bill introducing the government's proposed Commonwealth Integrity Commission, which is due to go before Parliament before the end of the year. That's the idea. But some fear the watchdog will have teeth but no fangs. Joining me now is Professor of Constitutional Law Anne Toomey and ICAC insider and top silk Geoffrey Watson. Welcome to both of you. Geoffrey, starting with you, do you see the government introducing this bill before the end of the year?
I think politically that's going to be difficult. It's got to go through too many processes. There's been enough delay. I think they'll put something on the table knowing that it won't be dealt with.
And what do you want corruption defined as in the federal government's proposal? There is some criticism that the corruption definition just isn't wide enough.
Well, indeed, it's not actually even really corruption that they're talking about there. There's a list of offences and they say, well, if you've committed one of those offences and it's an abuse of your office or it's perverting the course of justice. But the list of offences is really weird. So there's stuff about, letting out ballast water and how you deal with sediment, which clearly has absolutely nothing to do with politicians. So it's really directed at other sorts of things. Do they include, for example, electoral bribery offences? No. Do they include any electoral offences, including offences concerning false and misleading conduct in advertising? No. So, first of all, the offences side of it is inadequate. And secondly, they don't get to the core of what corruption is. Corruption really is about misuse of power. It's about using power not in the public interest, but in private interests. And it's about misusing the public resources that you've got or access to information that you got in the course of your office, and using it against the public interest or contrary to the public interest and using it for your own personal interest. And is any of that addressed in the Commonwealth draft bill? The answer is no. It's not really addressing corruption, and that's a serious problem in this type of thing.
Geoffrey, in recent times we've heard from key backbenchers. In fact, I've had them on afternoon briefing and they've raised concerns around the way the government has constructed the bill. We haven't seen the final version, so perhaps some of their concerns will be addressed, including the fact that there are two classes of the way law enforcement is treated differently to public servants, for instance, and politicians. How do you think that issue should be dealt with?
The two-class thing won't stay. I think the government only put that up as a kind of straw man because it's such a stupid division that they could never justify it. They'll give that away as though this is a proposal of compromise. That won't stay. There are fundamentals which are not part of which are in their proposal, which just need to be tossed out. The way in which referrals can be made is so limited. As Senator Patrick pointed out, a member of the public could see corruption. A member of the public could actually be involved in corrupting a public official and not be permitted to report it. It's just bizarre. It's a terrible model.
And to me, obviously we have royal commissions that the federal government can call when there may be issues, particularly when there is a mounting case. If we were to have a Federal Integrity Commission, could it do some of that work instead of these kind of mounting calls for royal commissions over and over?
Yes, and in fact it would be a much more efficient way of doing it as well, because as you know, royal commissions cost an awful amount of money. If you have an ongoing organisation with paid staff who are there regularly dealing with these sorts of things, you don't end up with the enormous costs of royal commissions. And you have people who are well experienced and used to working through all the rules. So it would certainly be a much better way of doing it. And it would mean that instead of everything building up to a head, you could actually have these things dealt with immediately when the issues arise, rather than waiting for things to get far worse along the way. So, yes, it would be a much more rational way of dealing with it.
Jeffrey, the crossbench, Labor, they say that it's better not to have this body rather than have a body that is toothless and can't do anything. Is that your view too? Or is it possible for the federal government to construct something that could later be improved by another government?
No. Do not introduce this current proposal. It'll be worse than nothing. In fact, as some of the earlier speakers have exposed, it actually operates to cover up. A corrupt politician could refer the matter off and it'll just go to ground. It's going to be dealt with in deadly secrecy. It could go to ground for years. And then, Paul Farrell wasn't quite right. It wouldn't be becoming public when the Federal Integrity Agency issued a report. No, it would only become public in the event that the federal DPP decided to prosecute and that indictment was presented to a court. So the politician could finish quite a happy, handsome, corrupt lifetime and then just leave politics years later. It's just awful. It's a means of actually encouraging and covering up corruption, not exposing it.
What are your thoughts on that, Anne?
Yes, and look, to add to that as well, one of the other really ghastly aspects of it is that, if a politician is accused of corruption, they could say, oh, that's all right. This has been referred off to the corruption agency and they found it not to be corrupt. Why? Well, because it didn't fall within one of those really limited criminal offences. But now you can assert, hey, I'm not corrupt. The Corruption Commission or the Integrity Commission hasn't found me to be corrupt. Well, it couldn't because it had such a limited definition and all the rest of it. And therefore you can assert that you're squeaky clean. So you're actually misleading people and saying that, everything you've done is fine because it doesn't fall within this absurdly narrow view of what corruption is. Hardly helpful.
Jeffrey, I want to turn to the time it takes for the state bodies to run their course. Is it too long, or do you think we've got the balance right? I'm thinking of the case of Obeid, for instance.
Oh, well, you've got to remember that we finished that corruption inquiry something like 7 years ago, and it's taken this long to prosecute. I don't understand that. It's true. I think there were 2 years lost due to interlocutory appeals and also to COVID. So that might explain some of it. Still, I agree, Patricia, it just takes too long. I think it's really kind of depressing. You can't blame, by the way, New South Wales ICAC for taking a long time with their deliberations, as I think I heard Ms Berejiklian say when she resigned. That's not right. ICAC's dependent upon government funding. Ms Berejiklian, as Premier, had presided over cutting back its funding. It can only spread its resources so thin, and it's got a tremendous wide range of activities that it pursues, many of which are positive, that is, encouraging proper systems to be put in place in government departments and the like. It's got to do all of that with the limited funds which it's given by the same government, then complains that it moves too slowly.
We're out of time. Thank you to both of you for joining us on the program.
It's a pleasure.
Jeffrey Watson and constitutional lawyer Anne Toomey there. Well, at the last election, the government promised an anti-corruption body would be one of its priority reforms in Parliament, but it has missed its deadline of establishing one within 12 months of taking office. An exposure draft for the proposed Commonwealth Integrity Commission has now been released, but as you've heard tonight, it's been criticised as weak and ineffective. In fact, there is a chorus of criticism about the construction of this body, even from the government's own backbench, with backbenchers saying they want to see changes. So we haven't seen the final legislation. It's moved from Christian Porter to now Michaelia Cash, who's the new Attorney General, who is constructing this legislation, promised by the end of the year. Shadow Attorney General Mark Dreyfus joined me a little earlier. We did invite the Attorney General Michaelia Cash and Assistant Attorney General Amanda Stoker to join the program. Both were unavailable. Mark Dreyfus, welcome.
Good to be with you.
The Centre for Public Integrity has said that this proposal that the Morrison government has suggested for a federal ICAC would be the weakest watchdog in the country. I know that you've seized on that to say that this is, not an acceptable model of an ICAC. Is this better than nothing, though, or if this is the proposal, do you think it's worth opposing?
No. It is not better than nothing, and I very much hope that the government is listening to a number of their own backbenchers who've agreed with the Centre for Public Integrity that the model that was put forward by Mr Morrison and his former Attorney General, Mr Porter, isn't good enough. We need a powerful, independent National Anti-Corruption Commission. The model that Mr Morrison's put forward is not that.
OK, so what are the key changes which have to be made to this proposal for it to pass the test for Labor to accept it?
There's a fundamental change, which is that you cannot have two divisions. Mr Morrison seems to think it's okay to have one division that will look at law enforcement and police officers and another division that will look at ministers and MPs and senior public servants, and they'd operate completely differently. The one in Mr Morrison's model for the MPs and ministers would be entirely in secret, wouldn't make public reports, wouldn't have public hearings, and that's just not good enough. So first thing, get rid of the two divisions. Second thing, it must have the power to hold hearings in public. Third thing, it must be able to act on its own motion. It must be able to act when it receives allegations from members of the public. It must be able to act when it gets whistleblowing from inside government. At the moment, in Mr Morrison's model, it couldn't do any of those things. There'd have to be a referral of an allegation by the government.
The government has been critical of, for instance, the New South Wales ICAC, saying it's destroyed careers over trivialities and that the way that it conducts its business is show trials. Barnaby Joyce now infamously calling it like a Spanish Inquisition. You've also said that there are some criticisms of perhaps the way some of these models work. How should that be fixed? And what are those criticisms that you have about the way that they operate?
I think there is an issue about what I'd call reputational damage, that there's the potential for these inquiries, it's an executive inquiry, it's not a court, to damage the reputations of people who are only witnesses. In other words, someone against whom no allegation has been made at all, but they get smeared. This has happened. People who've appeared before the New South Wales ICAC to assist in an inquiry have been the subject of shocking media smearing. I think you could possibly adopt some procedures to do something about that.
OK, what sort of procedures would help?
Requiring the Commission to state often and publicly that someone who is just there as a witness is not the subject of the inquiry, that no allegations are made against them. A requirement that the Commission do that. I think similarly for people against whom an allegation has been made who are then exonerated after an inquiry, we need to look for some formal process that requires the Commission in those circumstances to make a formal statement of exoneration. I think that would help. I do think that reputational damage is something that's behind a lot of the public concerns that have been expressed about ICAC.
We've got currently two very high-profile investigations, one in the ICAC, one IBAC in Victoria, looking at your political party, the Victorian Labor Party, and branch stacking. Out of those two models, which one do you think is preferable?
They're actually pretty similar. And what a wonderful demonstration, Patricia, of, first of all, independence. One of these anti-corruption commissions, the New South Wales one, is looking at the current government or former Premier in the current government. The one in Victoria is looking at a former minister in the current government. Independent. But I think what we need to get is actually just to have a strong and independent federal commission. The fact of these inquiries helps build confidence in government in Victoria and New South Wales. We sorely need that at the federal level. That's what I really want. And I think we've got an advantage here at the federal level. We can pick the best of each of the already existing 8 anti-corruption commissions. Every state and territory's already got one. Some of them have been in operation for more than 3 decades. We're in a happy position. It's probably the only good thing I can think of about coming last. We're in the happy position of being able to pick the best out of each of the models that have now been tried and defects identified at state and territory level.
Does Labor want to make this an election issue? Would you prefer not to vote for a government model that you clearly are saying is unsatisfactory and campaign for your model for a National Integrity Commission?
In government, we are going to create a powerful and independent anti-corruption
and
commission.
If this one is legislated before the election, will you seek to reform it?
Where is it? I moved to say
there
this was promised.
There is nothing yet, but if it is to happen before the election, are you saying that you just don't think that's plausible now?
Well, it won't be established before the next election. That's already clear, and Attorneys General Department officials said that at Senate estimates. It was promised by Mr Morrison and his former Attorney General, Mr Porter, on the 13th of December 2018. Feels like ancient history to say that. And we haven't seen legislation introduced into the Parliament. We've got 2 sitting weeks remaining this year. It will certainly have to go to a Senate inquiry because all complex legislation introduced to the Australian Parliament is sent appropriately to a Senate inquiry. Let's say the election's at the last possible time, May. It's still we don't have a sitting schedule for next year. It's very difficult to see how this could pass the Parliament ahead of the next election, and it is disgraceful. It's Mr Morrison's disgrace, yet another example of something that he's promised and not delivered on, that we haven't even now got an anti-corruption commission.
Okay, if he's able to table the legislation in the last sitting fortnight, would that deal with the issue? Do you think that would be an attempt by the Morrison government to show that it's serious about this?
Well, let's see. Let's see if Mr Morrison has paid attention to the public complaints from some of his backbenchers who've said that this and this aspect of it needs to be improved. Let's see if he's listened to the hundreds and hundreds of submissions that were sent to Mr Porter, most of which he chose not to make public but were sent to me. And I know from those submissions how critical the Australian community is of the currently proposed model from Mr Morrison. It's not good enough. It's more a lapdog than a watchdog, to use a phrase that Senator Jackie Lambie used in respect of Mr Morrison's model. It's not good enough. If he does bring forward legislation, but in the next 2 sitting weeks, of course we'll look at it, and of course we'll engage with it, and of course we'll debate it, because if it's anything like the model that Mr Morrison's had up until now, it won't be good enough.
Mark Dreyfus, thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much, Patricia.
And that was Shadow Attorney General Mark Dreyfus. And we did request an interview for tonight's special looking at federal ICACs and state ICACs with the Attorney General and the Assistant Attorney General to ask about the government's proposal too, but both were unavailable. Well, that's all we have time for at the moment. Thank you so much for watching, and you can catch up on this program on iView or on YouTube. I'm Patricia Carvelis. I hope you have a great night.